In the last video we went through changing the free energies of crystallization for a net structure and a tile structure. But this time we're going to look at the additional features that you can add to a simulation in Crystal Grower. So I've switched back to barite, which is a net-based structure. And this time I'm going to add a screw dislocation into the simulation with this command here. So if I change this to yes, in the user interface this is controlled by a radio button. Then it opens a new tab where you define your screw dislocation. But in this case it's going to give us some extra questions at runtime. So if I save this and then run my simulation, you can see it's asking me for my screw core H index. So these are Miller indices. In this case I'm going to have a screw running along the 001 direction, so I'll write 001. And my Berger's vector, or translation at the screw core in fractions of unit cells, is going to be 1.0. So it's going to translate one entire unit cell in the C direction. And then we can choose where we want to shift the screw core to. So do we want to move it in the AB direction? I'm going to just leave this as 0, 0, 0, so it's going to run straight through the center of my crystal. Then we get to the usual questions we get asked about grouping molecules or assigning different weighting to bonds. I'll just put in the same parameters I used previously. A key point if I'm going to use the same color file is I can't color the same facet as the screw dislocation is emerging from. That's because the facet identification works off the layers being flat. So if you have a dislocation, then that's not the case. So it won't be able to color them correctly. So the safest thing to do is to just omit it from the file completely, or create a copy where it's missing those facets. So I'll just create a second copy which still contains all the original facets if I want to do a simulation without a screw dislocation again. And in the one that I'm currently using, I'll just omit those two facets. And I'll change the number of facets down to 4. Now we can continue our simulation, typing in color, and we can let our simulation run to completion. So now our simulation is completed, we can visualize it using a veto again. You can see we've now added a screw dislocation on the top face. If we switch to the previous simulation, you can see there's no screw dislocation in place. But you can also see that the colouring on the top facet is missing because we omitted it from the file. But it's still intact on the other facets. So now let's try adding the additional feature of poisoning or growth modification. So we go back to our input.txt. And we'll keep the screw dislocation this time, but we'll change this line normal here to growth modifier. And we'll change this to simulation number 6. So now if we go back to running our simulation, we'll get some additional questions at runtime. So it'll ask us for our screw dislocation, the same as last time. So we'll define that. And we'll group our molecules together, and we won't have any different weighting for multiple bonds. Same delta mu for mode 5, and the same number of iterations. And we'll color our facets like before. Now we get to our additional parameters related to our growth modification. So we can choose the sites that we're going to attach our growth modifiers to. We don't know for barite if there are any sites that are susceptible to growth modifier attachment, but I'll just guess for now. So if I have a quick look into the count file for barite, I can get some idea of which sites are sensible to poison. So any of the empty sites, it makes sense to poison. It doesn't make sense to poison any of the grown sites, which are down in the bottom half of the file. So let's, for example, choose site number 24 on the sulfate, and we'll choose site number 105 for the barium. So if we go back to our Crystal Grower window, we'll type 24 and then 105. And then we'll press 0. That'll stop us having to enter any more site types. Then we choose in iterations how often the poison will attach. So I'll say every 10 iterations, for example. Then how long will the poison stay attached in numbers of iterations? So let's say it's quite a strong poison, it'll stay on for 100 iterations. Press enter. This will cause the simulation to run a bit slower as it's got to do a lot more calculations. But it's still relatively quick. Now let's visualize the structure in a veto. You can see we've got these extra white spheres on the surface. These are represented as species type 99. So if you want to change how they're displayed in a veto, you can choose type 99. And let's make them a bit bigger. So that's all of our poisons attaching to the surface. But you can see compared to the previous simulation that it didn't really make much of a difference to the overall morphology. If we poison some more sites, or change the frequency and residence time of the poison, we'd see a more dramatic effect. Now let's try looking at supersaturation excess, and how you input that using the executable version of Crystal Grower. Remember, everything I'm showing you here will also translate to using the terminal too. So let's go back to our input.txt and change this to simulation number 7. And this time we'll get rid of growth modifier and just type normal. And then we'll change this answer here from no to yes. So this is our supersaturation excess parameter. And we'll also change the mode too, just to make it easier to keep track of. Because your supersaturation excess is also dependent on your base delta mu, which is controlled by your delta mu mode. So if you pick delta mu mode 2, then it's easy to work out how your excess is behaving across the simulation. I'm also going to change my starting delta mu to 0, because then all of my excess values are going to be based off the equilibrium point of the system, which is also equal to the energy of your kink sites in your crystal structure. So now let's run our simulation and look at the different prompts that show up. So we'll have to input our screw dislocation, the same as previously, so we'll add the 001 screw, 1 Burgers vector, and 000 for the shift. Yes for grouping, no for multiple bonds. Now we're getting to the part where we define our supersaturation excess. So I'll ask for 3 periods. So this would be similar to running in delta mu mode 7. But the benefit of using the delta mu excess with mode 2 is that you can have as many periods of supersaturation as you want. So in the graphical user interface, this appears in a separate tab where you define all these periods and delta mu excesses. But using the executable version of Crystal Grower, you have to define it at runtime. So when does supersaturation period 1 end? I'll just say 300,000 iterations. And to ensure the crystal grows at the beginning, let's set a high excess for sulfate and barium. Put them as 20 kcal per mole each. So that's similar to what we had previously, where we had our starting delta mu as 20 in our input.txt. Then we'll say the second period ends at 500,000 iterations. And we'll give the sulfate a bit of a lower excess this time, so let's say 2.0 kcal per mole. And we'll increase the barium a little bit. So imagine experimentally you added an excess of barium salts to this mixture. So we'll set as 5 kcal per mole. And then it will automatically detect that the final period should end when the simulation ends, so it sets it as 1 million iterations. And let's give sulfate a 0 excess, so it's at equilibrium. And let's say our barium is now at 2.0 kcal per mole excess. And then we'll colour our facets again. So let's visualize this simulation and see how that's changed the morphology of the crystal. You can see that it hasn't had much of an effect on the overall morphology. But if you compare with the 2 previous simulations, you can see that it's had quite an effect on the surface topology. So these side facets are a bit rougher, these edges are a bit more rounded, and there's a bit more rounding happening at the corners here. So let's say we now wanted to take this crystal forward as a seed crystal for the next simulation. We can use the checkpointing feature in Crystal Grower to do this. And I'll show you how to do this in the standalone executable version of Crystal Grower. So we need to go back and change our input.txt again. So let's set this as simulation number 8. So I've previously said that I wanted to save a checkpoint at the end of each of these simulations that I've run, but I haven't said that I want to load a checkpoint. So this time I'm going to say yes to the checkpoint load, which now means that I have to define which file I want to actually load. So I know that it's in the same folder as my simulation output, so I can just copy and paste that here. And I know that the simulation was called 7 barite tutorial, so I can put that here. And I know that the file is going to be called checkpoint.txt, so I can just add that in here. So now this is going to carry on my simulation using the endpoint of that simulation as the starting point for this one. So by the end of the simulation it will have actually completed 2 million iterations, but it's done it in 2 halves. So let's run that simulation and see what extra questions come up again. So I'll double click my Crystal Grower executable, and it'll ask me the same questions to start with. Got to define our screw dislocation again. And you can see that a lot of the options get fixed when you're using a checkpoint, but it'll inform you of which options you're not allowed to change. But now we're going to define our new periods of supersaturation excess. So let's say we wanted to add another 2 periods to our already completed 3 periods. So this time we'll run for 500,000 iterations on our first period, and we'll flip the excesses around. So at the end of our previous simulation, our sulfate has an excess of 0 and our barium had an excess of 2. So let's give the sulfate 2 and barium 0, and then for the final period, let's just put them both as equal to 0. Again, we're not going to see much because we're not taking a movie. We're only going to see the final crystal, but if we took a movie, we would see how the growth changes over the simulation. So we'll color our facets again. Because we're using a checkpoint, we need to define the memory that we're going to use to grow our crystal. Crystal Grower can work things out automatically, but it has to start from an empty box. So in this case, it's not starting from an empty box, it's starting from a seed crystal. So all we need to do is just make the box slightly larger, but you have to use a bit of judgment here. So we know that we're only going to grow the crystal at some very low supersaturations. So we probably don't need the box to be much larger. So I'll just resize the box to 201, 301, and 151 unit cells and run the simulation. And it'll tell you when the checkpoint's been processed, and it'll tell you a lot of information about what it's carrying over from the previous simulation. But otherwise the simulation will just run like a normal simulation. So now we can open up this simulation, and we can see that we'll have grown a larger crystal. So if we compare this with the previous simulation, you can see that it's grown a little bit larger. And you can also see there's a bit more rounding happening, because we did spend the last half of the simulation at equilibrium. You can see that the shape of the screw dislocation has changed, it's become a lot more rounded, but the overall morphology is roughly the same, aside from at the corners. So checkpointing is really useful because you can also use it to recolor your crystal. So if your layers are slightly incorrect with coloring, but you don't want to have to regrow your crystal, because that can actually change the outcome due to Crystal Grower being a Monte Carlo program, you can use a checkpoint to run the simulation for just another 2 iterations, but use a different facet coloring file to define your facets. So we've covered a few additional features here that can be added to tile and net-based structures. So screw dislocations can be added to both types, supersaturation excess can be added to both types, and poisoning can be added to both types. But there are a few features that only apply to net-based structures, and I'll just run through them both now. So let's go back to our input.txt, and we'll run simulation number 9. This time we don't want to read in a checkpoint, we'll just start from scratch, because we're going to change some features which are fixed by checkpoints anyway, as they control the number of site types in your system. So we'll set this line to no, and for simplicity we'll go back to mode 5, and we won't have any supersaturation excess. And we'll nucleate at 20 kcal per mole. We'll also remove our screw dislocation, just for simplicity. So now let's run our simulation, and I want to focus on these first 2 questions. So these will only appear when you're using a net-based structure. So if you want to group your molecules, yes or no. This is just to simplify the calculation in Crystal Grower. If you say yes, it will group all species that are crystallographically the same together. So in barite, for example, you've got 4 sulfates and 4 bariums. They've all got the same coordination. If you say yes, it will group all the bariums together, and then it will group all the sulfates together. If you say no, then it'll separate all the species, so you have to control them individually. If I said no here, I would have to assign 8 delta mu excesses for every period. But it can be important when you're looking at chiral-based structures to ungroup your molecules. So this time I'll type yes again. And then this is another crucial question which only appears for net-based structures. This will allow you to assign different energy penalties for bidentate interactions versus monodentate interactions. So for example, if I type yes here, it will ask me to assign different energy scalings for different coordinations of sulfate. So coordination 1 will be 1 times the energy that I've assigned in the net.txt file. Coordination 2, I'll say, is 1.2 times the energy in the net.txt file. And the third coordination I'll set as 1.4 times the energy in the net.txt file. For barium, I don't want to have to type it all in, I'll just leave them all as 1. The easiest way to do that is to just type the number 0, and it will assign all of the coordinations as 1 times the scaling in the net.txt file. Then we can assign our delta mu for mode 5. The coordination scaling actually affects the location of the equilibrium. So in this case, I'll just put it a little bit higher than 0.5. otherwise we might dissolve our crystal, so I'll set it at 3.0. The correct process here would be to run in mode 3 to find the new equilibrium point, and then base our delta mu around that. I'll say 500,000 iterations. And I'll colour the crystal again. So let's visualize this structure in Avito. You can see that there's been a large effect on the crystal morphology compared to the previous simulation. So you've gone from a plate that's thin in the C direction to a crystal which is more rod-like in the C direction. You still have the same facets, but they're expressed in different amounts. So now we've covered all the additional crystallization features that can be added to both tile and net systems, along with those that can only be added to net-based systems. There is one additional feature that you need to be aware of, which might not be obvious from what I've covered in this video, and that's how to do additional sweeps for internal defects. So these are generally more important for tile-based systems, but they can be used with net-based systems too. So it's quite a simple change. If we go back to our input.txt file, and you can see a pair of lines here, 9 and 10, which are 1 and 1. And we covered these in the first video in the series. So line number 9 is how many checking sweeps. 1 is normal, 2 is to clear internal defects. So if I wanted to look at internal defects in this system, I would just change this to 2. The reason we leave this as 1 by default is that it has to do an additional sweep of all the neighbours, so this can actually slow down your simulation time. I won't show a full example of this because it's covered in a separate video, but this will correct some species that are still being shown as ungrown and remove them from the visualization output. So that was just a crash course in adding all the additional crystallization features, but doing it without the user interface. They weren't detailed examples because they've all been covered in separate videos. This is just meant to be a tutorial showing you how to activate all these options. In the next video we'll move on to actually using the terminal and using some shortcuts to speed up simulation submission.